and welcome to the UK column. I'm delighted today to be joined by Vanessa Beeley, and well, we're going to have a bit of a conversation, Vanessa, about the current events. It's probably going to be quite wide-ranging, but I suppose the issue which has sparked this discussion is the ongoing issue of immigration, particularly today. We're recording this on Saturday, the 13th of September, and of course, this is the day of the Million Man March that Tommy Robinson has organised. It's early in the morning, so we don't know exactly how that's going to go. But, obviously there is significant feeling in the country about the issue of immigration. And I would suggest that the focus of that angst and that emotion is something which is being targeted by kind of agents of the state that would like to see this being blown up into a major issue of conflict. It's certainly already a major issue of division around the country. And it's not just happening in the UK either. The United States is experiencing this to some degree, European countries as well. So, we have been saying on the UK column news over the last several weeks that this smacks of some kind of psychological operation. It's certainly driving people to extremes of positions and developing an issue of sectarianism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we've talked about this also on UK column, the policy or the strategy of sowing division, which has been used to a large degree very successfully in the West Asia region. And we're seeing it now being particularly ramped up in Syria since the fall of the former government back in December 2024 and the bringing to power of what is effectively a terrorist unelected regime headed up by a former ISIS and Al-Qaeda chief in Iraq and Syria. And his entire administration are former or still are Takfiri elements. And the sectarianism that is now being exacerbated in order to eventually bring about the partitioning or the federalization of Syria. I've written about that this week at UK column. People can go and read that for more detail on how it's actually being done. But my fear is, if we go back throughout history, this has been used to sow division, to sow hatred, to sow marginalization of certain communities within a population. If we go back to the 70s in the UK and the claims by media that black people were committing the majority of the crimes of violent mugging. If we go to the 90s in the United States, when Hillary Clinton was amplifying the fact that there were hyper-violent crime acts being committed by what were known as the super predators, which were black people in the United States. And that, of course, has led to police vilification and abuse of these communities, but also popular sentiment turning against those communities. And if we fast forward now, of course, in the US, we're seeing the same kind of criminalization of the immigrant communities in the United States, particularly from Latin America. I'm sure it's no coincidence that Venezuelans are being included in that, in some kind of gang war narratives that, of course, are being disproven, but the disproving of those narratives comes well after the media and political institutions and dubious special interest groups are involved in basically drumming those narratives into people's brains and pushing them to effectively turn against sectors of their society, some of them the poorest and the most segregated and marginalized sectors of their society, without any attempt to bridge the gaps with those communities within their own society. And that's what I find kind of depressing is we should have learned COVID, in my opinion, was another exercise to see how this would work. Because COVID, although it's not a racialized event, it was an event that divided people against those who believed in COVID, those who didn't or suspected that it was some kind of project, those that believed in the vaccines, those that didn't, those that believed in bodily autonomy, those that didn't. Brexit, the same thing. People were divided along political lines on that, even class lines to some extent, when one looks at who actually was pro-Brexit, who was against, and so on. These are all exercises to divide us, and we're not learning each time when they happen, and how the media is amplifying one narrative over another and pushing people towards some kind of division and internal strife and hatred of other sectors of their society. And, I don't like using the word hatred, but that's what it actually comes down to.
Well, I have to say, obviously the most recent event in the United States, the murder of Charlie Kirk, is a great example of this as well. I mean, I have to admit, I don't spend half as much time on X or the social media platforms as I should.
It's a good thing, I think. Well, I have to admit, I was just the degree of vitriol between the left and the right, and bearing in mind that my personal view, and you can criticize this if you wish, but my personal view is that left and right are fake divisions. That it's time for us to stop looking left and right and start looking up as a combined community. And exactly.
This is our problem. We constantly fall for this looking left and looking right instead of looking up, and we get played every time.
Yeah, and of course, what's the ultimate goal of this kind of strategy? I think what you saw almost immediately was a knee-jerk reaction, which I would say, was planned in advance to some degree by Trump, to bring in greater pre-crime surveillance, greater punitive measures against pre-crime, against the potential for crime based on what happened to Charlie Kirk without any investigation. And this is what we keep seeing. So every time that these divisions are exacerbated, orchestrated, and people fall for it, what happens? We end up in a situation where greater totalitarian measures are brought in to control and surveil the public and the population generally, not just one sector of the population, but the entire population, and to distract from whatever the government is doing, which is criminal. I mean, Keir Starmer has had meetings with the president, Isaac Herzog, of a genocidal entity proven by the ICJ, of committing genocide against Palestinians. Was it the general public's opinion that he should be allowed into the country to have meetings, to be given a platform at Chatham House, to mention one, to justify and excuse the actions of the Israeli regime against Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, which is an ongoing slaughter? And as many physicians now are saying, it's that the psychopathy runs across the entire Israeli population. I mean, I saw an interview the other day with a psychologist and a doctor who was saying exactly this. So this is coming from expert opinion. It's not something that I'm making up. And yet our government is not only welcoming individuals from within the ruling class of that entity, as we've been discussing on UK Column, has embedded itself in British society, in British healthcare, military, cyber surveillance, weapons manufacture, the training of British military, etc. And we're not given a say in this. And this is the point. So what happens is each of these division tactics widens the chasm between the general public and the ruling class that then are effectively surveilling the general public if they are challenging any policy of the government. There's no representation of the general public anymore in this country. There is literally surveillance, disproportionate force against dissent. We're seeing that now with the Defense of Palestine action. We're seeing elderly people literally being picked up off the street and arrested. It's extraordinary. And every time that we fall for one of these orchestrated division paradigms, we're enabling further enforcement of what is effectively a fascist regime.
So on Friday the 12th news program at the end, Patrick made the point, reminded everybody, because today is the 13th and the day of the Million Man March. Patrick reminded everybody that the George Cross flag and the patron saint of England, St. George, that his mother was Palestinian. Now, why was he doing that? And I got an email from somebody this morning saying, how dare he do that? This was disrespectful. Of course, it wasn't being disrespectful to the flag at all. It was pointing out an irony here, because, of course, once again, we have the situation where large numbers of people are wanting to rely on what they perceive to be a knight in shining armour to come along and save the day. And in the case of the UK, that's Tommy Robinson. And the irony of this whole thing is that Tommy Robinson is, to a large degree, supported and funded by that Zionist entity that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so one of the features of the current angst of the immigration issue is that all the focus is on the Muslim community, despite the fact that the immigration issue is not even close to being restricted to the Muslim community. In fact, the Muslim community is a relatively small part of the issue now, because there's lots of Central African people from Central Africa coming, people from Albania, people from other Slavic countries, and so this is not a sort of Pakistan, Bangladesh kind of issue by any means. Afghanistan, although there have been quite a number coming from Afghanistan and Syria as a result of the conflict. But the point is, this is not about, the immigration issue is not a Muslim issue, but it's being made a Muslim issue by Tommy Robinson. And then you've got to ask the question, why is it being made a Muslim issue? And could it by any chance be something to do with the fact of who he is supported by and their particular agenda? And so people are falling for a trap again, it seems to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you and I discussed with Professor David Miller, who are actually where the term Islamic extremism originated from. And of course, that was from within the Zionist movement. They created the fear of Islamic extremism, portraying it as a patriarchal, anti-women, vicious Sharia law concept, when in reality, Israel itself is supporting and funding the extremist factions that originated in Qatar and Saudi Arabia, particularly in Qatar, Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood, in Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabi extremist strain of Islam, that are now the ruling regime in Syria, doing deals with Israel, allowing Israel to expand further into Syrian territory, meeting with Israel on the sidelines of the UNGA, supposedly on September the 24th. Jolani is going and is destined, apparently, according to Israeli media, to be meeting with Netanyahu and representatives there. So it's very clear. And if you look at the history, the fact that Saudi Arabia, through the Darin Treaty, was created at the same time as the Zionist entity by the British, and that those particular Gulf states were protected by the British in order to provide the kind of protectionism and apologism for the Zionist entity from its inception as an occupying force on Palestinian territory. So it's very clear that they are allied throughout history, and that alliance was created by the British. But of course, what the Zionist movement is doing is demonizing not those factions, because those factions are useful to Zionism, particularly as we're seeing in Syria, and also they're being weaponized potentially against Lebanon. We've been hearing reports that the Takfiri elements in Syria are going to be used to attack Lebanon to, of course, destroy the resistance against Israel there, at the same time as Washington and Tel Aviv are planning an economic free trade zone in southern Lebanon, which means the occupation of Lebanese territory, right? But the reality is, what is Israel doing? It's effectively targeting pro-Palestinian Muslim elements globally, because since Jolani has come to power in Syria, what has he done? He's dismantled the Palestinian resistance there. He's disarmed it. He's imprisoned leaders of Palestinian resistance that have been in Syria, many of them for decades. So effectively, he's there also to dismantle Palestinian resistance there. They're targeting Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. And now, of course, what's happening is that you're seeing the Zionist movement leading a campaign, even through the NHS, against British Palestinian doctors. We've reported on this also on UK Column, to effectively deprive them of their career, of their jobs, to drive them out of the National Health Service, and bring in, again, we've reported on this, bring in Zionist-aligned doctors and medical staff that have a record of violating the rules of the GMC, the General Medical Council, but of course, who have been protected by the Zionist movement and who have not received the punitive measures that British Palestinian or British doctors who support Palestine are going to be on the receiving end of. So, for me, it's absolutely clear who is behind this level of division.
Yes, exactly. Now, and as you say, the focus of the ire of people is on ordinary Muslims and
who are part of British society and have been, 2-3 generation.
Indeed, the two points to make here. The first is that I think must be nearly 20 years ago now. The UK column invited the chairman of Birmingham Central Mosque, Dr. Mohammed Nazim, to come and speak here. It was a very interesting conversation. He was talking about why he and his people of his generation came to the UK in the first place. And it was because of their perception of the rule of law and the lifestyle and so on. But then in more recent years and so on, we've had other Muslim friends tell us about how things have changed within the Muslim, not within the Muslim community, but within the mosques and so on, in particular, some mosques having new imams being brought in and new ideologies being brought in, and a type of Islam that they were absolutely unfamiliar with being preached in these places. And they were asking very serious questions about who were these people and why were they here, and what was this version of Islam, and something that that struck me in something that you said to me back at the time of the change of government in Syria was that overnight the call to prayer changed from being something which had beauty to being something which was harsh and actually quite unpleasant to listen to, and that overnight it was clear that a new ideology had arrived. Now, let's just talk a little bit about that ideology, because this is something that most people don't appreciate. Is something that was really created by Britain.
Yeah, it was. I mean, again, if we go back to Saudi Arabia, and around the same time of kind of Sykes-Picot and the Balfour Declaration, which of course was heralding in the Zionist occupation and ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which ramped up in 1948 and has never actually stopped. Of course, it's intensified again since October the 7th. But if we go back to the history of Saudi Arabia itself, in the beginning, the British tried to ally with Hussein Sharif. And the fact is that even back then, the division was created in the sense that they then aligned themselves more with the Al Saud family because they were prepared to drop the cause of Palestine. Hussein Sharif was not prepared to drop the cause of Palestine. Lawrence of Arabia went to try and offer him monetary benefits or incentives to do so, and he refused. So basically what happened, the British unleashed the House of Saud Wahhabi forces on Hussein Sharif, which is the Hijazi area of Saudi Arabia. And that's when Wahhabism became the dominant ideology in Saudi Arabia, purely because it's designed to support Zionism. It's designed to support the Israeli state, such as it is. And that is what it has done historically. When has Saudi Arabia ever attacked Israel? When has it ever defended a country that is being attacked by Israel? On the contrary, right now, Saudi Arabia is effectively trying to drive an economic collapse of Lebanon by withholding reconstruction aid and investment on the basis that will flow once Hezbollah agree to disarm, or once the Lebanese army is weaponized against Hezbollah, which is never going to happen. So Saudi Arabia is acting, if you like, as an arm of the Zionist entity, and that has been its historical role. And the Wahhabi doctrine, I mean, I was just actually, before I came on, I was reading a Facebook post that somebody sent me from a Wahhabi guy based in America working for Amazon, but who is putting posts on his Facebook basically saying, you know, we have the right under our ideology, our Islam, to slaughter the Nusayri, which are the Alawites and the Shia Muslims in Syria. We can rape them, we can kill them, we can slaughter them, we can slaughter all infidels. This is the mentality, exactly the same ethno-supremacism that Zionism is. That's what Wahhabism, Ikhwan, which is political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood, which again has been weaponized by the British and the Americans, particularly in Syria, since its creation in Egypt in the 20s and 30s, right? So these are weapons of colonialism. These are weapons of imperialism, and these are partners in the crimes of the Zionist entity against the region, the whole region, not only Palestine, of course, because the strategy is to destroy any resistance to Zionist dominance. And of course, by Zionist, I mean the entire Zionist bloc, which are the Arab Gulf states, the West. Turkey is kind of on the outskirts right now. That's a little bit more complicated because there's competition between the neo-Ottoman agenda and the Zionist expansionism. And so therefore these factions, and you're absolutely right, it's a perversion of Islam. It's a form of Islam that has absolutely nothing to do with what Islam actually represents. And that's the problem, is that people don't understand that true Islam is the religion of peace. And I can hear people, raising their hands in horror right now. But at the same time, please bear with me, because I've lived in Muslim majority countries for the last on and off 15 years. I know what true Islam is. It's living in those countries, particularly in Syria, which is Muslim majority, and it is Sunni Muslim majority. But those Sunni Muslim, for the majority, they reject Wahhabism. They reject the kind of fanatic sectarian ethno-supremacism that is being seen from the Jilani regime, that is responsible for the massacres of the Druze, of the Alawites, of the Christians in Syria, the ethnic cleansing that is now being seen in Syria, the resettlement of Takfiri elements in formerly Alawite or Christian or Druze areas. And the majority of Sunni Muslims, although they're terrified to speak out publicly, privately, do not adhere to these policies. And this is exactly what we're now facing in the UK. If people don't try and understand what true Islam is and what true Muslim communities are. Yeah, Mike, you're absolutely right. There were Saudi imams being brought in across Europe and in the UK leading up to the regime change war against Syria, which of course was led by Bush and Blair, so by the British and the Americans. And that entire practice was to radicalize British Muslims in order for them to go and perform jihad. I don't use the terminology jihadist, but to go and fight under the banner of Wahhabism, Takfiri extremism, in order to secure a Takfiri caliphate in the region, not only in Syria, but to expand into Iraq and onwards, right? Even in Lebanon.
And just to clarify, Wahhabism and Takfiri, those Wahhabi and Takfiri, these terms are synonymous?
Yeah, they are. I mean, Takfirism is that kind of extremist Islam, yes.
Yeah.
But when you talk about, Islamists or jihadists, I don't like those terms, because jihad is actually a personal struggle. It's a spiritual struggle, generally speaking. Islamist, of course, is a term that was coined by the Zionist movement. And many people sort of have been channeled by media outlets into using that terminology, which in itself is a language that is not recognized by the majority of Muslims. And, when we talk about Saudi imams, just finishing that point, coming into Britain and Europe to radicalize Muslim communities, we have to again remember that Saudi Arabia was effectively created. The House of Saud was weaponized by the British to support the Zionists. So, in other words, these Muslim youths are being radicalized effectively by the Zionist movement in order to fight their wars for them in the Middle East.
And so it's vitally important to understand the history of the Middle East, and we could say that we have been propagandized with films like Lawrence of Arabia over the years to believe a certain version of history. But a point that, the point that you're making very clearly here, and I think we need to keep reinforcing, is that, and part of the reason that Syria is so important is because it was an example of a majority Muslim country which had no sectarianism of any kind. It was multiple faiths and cultures living together absolutely happily, who were Syrian first and whatever their particular culture happened to be second. But that over the course of the conflict there since 2011, and particularly since the what happened in December, the country is now facing a form of sectarianism, which is really unprecedented and really pretty horrendous, and certainly much, much worse than was ever seen in countries like Northern Ireland, for example.
Absolutely. And you know, even during the regime change war, and particularly in the last 4 or 5 years when Trump's economic policy, which of course was to impose the Caesar Act sanctions, which penalized any country that wanted to come to the assistance of Syria, even during the earthquake back in 2023, I think, from memory. That deepened the poverty and raised the specter of sectarianism, but it still didn't take hold. It actually only took hold when Jolani took power. And of course, that was the intention, because his dominance of Idlib led only to sectarianism. His entire construct was sectarian. The White Helmets, which were an organization created by the West, led by the UK and MI6, were a sectarian organization. The founder, James Le Mesurier, actually said this in an interview with Georgetown University, I think around 2016. He said the one problem is it's a sectarian organization. So this sectarianism came from the West, right? It was created by the West, not by Syria itself. Or since Hafez al-Assad, the country had been a cohesive social secular fabric that, as you said, was inclusive of all religions and all sects. Nobody asked what sect their neighbor was. More Muslims celebrated Christmas than the Christians. I mean, I always remember going out on the streets of Damascus. The majority of people taking selfies in front of the Christmas decorations and the huge trees that lined the streets were Muslim, many of them hijabi, right? And this was what Syria was. If you went out on the old city on a Friday or a Saturday night, you would see Muslims alongside Christians, alongside atheists and so on, all out drinking, dancing, having a good time. That was what Syria was. Now it isn't. Now it's really being plunged into a sectarianism that I think in the entire history of Syria it's not experienced. It's unprecedented. Yeah.
And we are starting to see the same thing happening in the UK. And what I really want to touch on here is how this is developed. I mean, for example, the whole issue of two-tier policing. And everybody saying, you know, lots of people blaming migrants for two-tier policing when in fact somebody has made a decision to treat people in a certain way. So, you know, anybody that's you know, raising an issue of the migrant issue and speaking out on social media, having their being censored or worse, ending up in prison for what they said, when in fact all they did was say something. They didn't actually take any violent action themselves. That, of course, helps to radicalize people, because that by taking that particular action against somebody who's made a statement on social media, you're then encouraging other people to believe that they can't say anything, and therefore. And my point is, it causes people to feel like they're under attack, and that pushes them towards extremes. And this is something that we've got to recognize first of all, and then recognize where that is coming from. Because I suppose part of the problem here is that because the migrants themselves seem like a relatively easy target. There's a tendency for people to fall into the trap of just focusing on that relatively easy target, whereas if it's government policy they're having to deal with, or the police, or increasing, you know, perhaps in the future the military, that is a much scarier prospect. Sorry, I haven't expressed that very well, but I'm just, I'm trying to get this out as best I can.
I mean, I think that's the point of this conversation is to have this conversation, because we're not necessarily going to arrive at conclusions, but I think it's all about talking about these issues. And the problem is that we live in a society that has been pushed towards partitioning of discussion and the protection of confirmation bias and so on. And so people don't really want to engage in discussions that challenge their own learned responses or their own biases. Or their own cognitive dissonance. I mean, we're seeing it in all sectors, Mike, and at UK Column, we've seen it in varying degrees across all the major issues that we've covered and UK Column has covered for years. This happens all the time. And so I think what is important is for people to engage, and we've talked about this again on UK Column when certain issues have been brought up, like the creation of a new mosque in a city centre somewhere that people feel threatened by. Go and talk to the Muslim community that is building the mosque. Go and actually discuss with them your fears. I feel we're not doing that. And we're not allowing ourselves to create the bridges that are being broken by the media, by special interest groups that are generally backed by the government or funded by the government or funded by external entities like Israel, to basically push through certain policies and to secure the general public's approval of those policies because of their own fears and their own manufactured distaste towards some sectors of society, right? And at the same time, I'm going to be very clear here. I'm not diminishing the risks to British society, because again, that's another layer of what's happening, of course, is that societies for many years now have been deliberately fractured, right? Disconnection from faith and religion, disconnection from children, from families, and so on. We're seeing it from every angle. So I'm not diminishing that. And people should also recognize that. But as you said, we're being driven to turn against each other rather than look up, as you said, look up to the ruling class, to the billionaire class, to the oligarchs, to the institutional racist organizations that are pushing these narratives in order to create the divisions that ultimately is going to destroy society, right? We're hearing in the United States of the potential for civil war. Well, the civil war is only going to happen if people allow themselves to be divided, for example, over the killing of Charlie Kirk. Right? It's insane, as you said. I mean, I kind of stayed off X for 24 hours. And I spoke to Fiorella Isabel last night and we talked about it, but I was like, at the end of the day, this is just another issue which we're all being reactionary about instead of understanding the underlying strategy that all these events are going to be exploited to push through, right? Whether it's increased totalitarianism, surveillance, medical measures, etc., etc. We have to understand that we shouldn't be reactionary to one issue, particularly if it's being amplified across the board universally by the media. Then we should raise questions almost immediately. And on that point, I just wanted to say something about, the idea of where the Muslim grooming gang prominent narrative came from, right? I was actually just reading this up this morning, that in 2019, there was a report done by two journalists, award-winning journalists, Brian Cathcart and Paddy French, called Andrew Norfolk, the Times newspaper, and anti-Muslim reporting a case to answer. Now, what they're talking about was that this entire narrative began back in 2011. It was generated by the Times, which of course is Murdoch-owned. An unknown journalist, Andrew Norfolk, wrote 3 articles, 2 about the grooming situation in the north of England, 1 about the foster care situation. But the Cathcart and French report found the central allegations to be unfounded and that there were serious inaccuracies that the Times has never been held accountable for. Now, again, I'm not diminishing what is really happening, but why are we being pushed to focus on one sector of society? Just as in the 70s, as I said, we were pushed to focus on the issue being from the black society, the black communities in the UK, right? So all the time we're being pushed to focus on one aspect, which one reduces our ability to look at all the other aspects that play into the child abuse, child abduction, paedophilia in this country, much of which, according to reports before 2011, from people like Sonia Poulton, of course, originate even in the British Parliament. But that's kind of sidelined now, right? Because the focus is all on the Asian grooming gangs. I mean, point out if I'm wrong. But, what I find interesting, is how this originated. So it originated from within British media.
Yes.
And it was then amplified and given undue prominence by British media, despite the inaccuracies and the unfounded allegations that were found in a later report in 2019. But that's always the problem. The discovery of inaccuracies in these reports and in these media campaigns comes later. So by then, the story has gathered traction and it's imprinted itself in people's psyche. And therefore, it's easy then to trigger that reaction against one sector of society because it's already been imprinted.
I want to make a number of points on this. The first is that the UK column has been heavily criticised by some over the years for trying to make exactly the point that you're making there, and to make the point that the child abuse issue is much bigger than the Muslim grooming gang issue, and just to reiterate once again, that's not to in any way take away from or diminish what the people that were involved in that experience. The point is just one example of exactly what you're talking about, Vanessa. The UK does not hold any kind of statistics on the ethnic makeup of child abusers. They don't do that. And yet someone has managed to pull together some statistics which claim that the incidence of child abuse is much more prevalent amongst the Muslim community than any other community in the UK. Now, how did they do that when there are no statistics?
You can't find any
statistics. There aren't any. They're not collected. So of course you can't find them, right? So that is a narrative that has been created from somewhere. Now, I don't know where that's come from, but it is a narrative that has been created from somewhere. And that's just one example. Now, if you are wanting to, let's say you're taking a long-term view of something and you want to create a particular narrative within society in order to drive society in a particular direction. One of the things that you might do is that you might cause the police or the social services departments in particular parts of the country to stand down from investigating certain criminal activity, and you allow that criminal activity to take place with impunity. And then you build a narrative which says that the reason that this was allowed to happen was because the people within the police or within social services or within the town and city councils were scared of being called racist. This is complete nonsense. This is a narrative which has been built in order to actually radicalize a section of society, which is the white indigenous, if you want to use that term, population, against the people that were perpetrating these crimes, because the crimes were not investigated and were not stopped. But the child abuse issue has not been investigated or stopped in many other parts of the world where the children involved were white children being abused by white adults, including, as you've said, white politicians, including a former prime minister. So, you know,
and children, if we're talking child abuse, Mike, I mean, the entities that the British government has created in this region, for example, I mean, if the child abuse is off the scale, rape of kids in prisons, rape of prisoners by the guards, both female and male, the shooting of kids in the genitalia. The list is endless. You know, the mass slaughter of children in this region for decades now by our governments, and the child trafficking, of course, that is one of the primary harvests of these wars that are created by our ruling elite. And not only, of course, the harvest of children, the harvest of organs, the red market. So when we're talking about abuse on an industrial scale, that is coming from within our ruling class, our white establishment ruling class.
One of the other things that I just want to touch on here that we've been talking about for many years is the psychological operations side of things, because I think it's important to remind everybody that this is a thing. Now, I'm really glad to say that it was us that originally exposed the Behavioral Insights team's influence on the SAGE group within government during the COVIDocracy, which basically said we've got to start using applied psychology to make the COVID situation much more fearful for people, because that's the only way we're going to get them to conform to what we want them to conform to. We've talked about the Mindspace document, talking about people's minds being changed on things and people not understanding why their minds have been changed or not even being aware that their minds have been changed on something. So we're talking about an entire infrastructure within the British regime, which has been exported to other parts of the world, which is designed to manipulate minds in ways that people don't understand. And I think one of the things that I find, in a sense, most therapeutic about what we do, Vanessa, is that I'm able to look at events kind of objectively, kind of from as if I'm not part of it. I'm sort of looking at it as if I'm watching a movie or something from a detached perspective. And it helps to try to try to identify what is real and what is fake, let's say, or what is manipulated and what isn't. And I think this is something that we need to encourage. Part of the problem here is that people are so emotionally attached to their heroes or to current events that it becomes very difficult to be objective about what's going on. And I'm not in any way saying that I'm always right. I'm not even saying that I'm ever right. I'm just, this helps me, I feel, helps me deal with current events in a way which is going to result in coming to the right conclusions, I think. And I would just suggest that maybe that's something that people should be encouraged to do, to take that step back.
Absolutely. Again, people still buy into, this kind of savior complex, whether it's holding BRICS up as, this utopian alternative to US, UK neocolonialism and hegemony. I would raise questions about that, because I raise questions about any powerful force, because for me, if you have power, you have responsibility. And if you have responsibility and you're not living up to that responsibility, then you should be held to account. none of the BRICS countries, for example, are taking any action to end the genocide in Palestine and Israeli expansionism in the region, which of course is leading to further slaughter of the people of the region. I
suppose with the possible exception of South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, South Africa, yes, have taken, and I'm not including Iran, of course, either, because Iran is in fact, Ayatollah Khamenei, as we said on the news on Wednesday, is calling for the quarantine of the entity from all non-Muslim and Muslim countries. So he's been very clear that it is necessary now to economically blockade Israel, diplomatically blockade Israel until the genocide is stopped. And people have said to me, yeah, well, if they do that, then the West will just step in. Fine, let the West step in, because they haven't got the resources to be able to keep Israel afloat while they're starting and igniting all of these other perpetual wars, like in Latin America, maintaining it in Ukraine. Let them step in. Great. Because, sorry, that will be the end of support for Zionism. Hopefully, it might take time. But the fact is that, yes, South Africa has stepped up and brought the case to the ICJ, but they haven't ended trade. There are still elements within South Africa that are supplying weapons that are connected to the state, right? I'm not saying they're the worst of it. I mean, certainly China is expanding its trade. I'm not going to get too far down this discussion because that's for another day. But I think my point is we shouldn't be looking for someone else to come in and save us, or another entity to come in and change the global paradigm that we're living in right now, where humanity is effectively under threat, where, even what's happening in Palestine is a psychological war, because we're effectively being driven to believe that we're helpless, we're powerless. And that's a very important factor in what is being done to humanity and populations globally, is this sense of learned helplessness, where we look around and nobody's really doing anything. And BRICS plays into that. Because if BRICS were to step up, for example, if Russia and China and India were to cut all trade with Israel, that would have a domino effect. But right now, we're all existing within this learned helpless bubble. And only the very few are taking action against that, like Palestine Action in the UK, those that are supporting them and being arrested for their trouble. But it's still a minority, Mike, and we know this, but so I think what people, and I've had to kind of learn this myself, just as you have, to detach from these situations, and it's very difficult. I'm living here. I'm seeing it on a daily basis. I'm hearing it on a daily basis. I'm hearing from friends in Syria that Jolani's forces are about to do a sweep of the area they're living in, for example, which could mean their imprisonment, it could mean their execution, it could mean their eviction from their homes and the resettlement of Takfiri elements. So we're living through it on a daily basis here. But
so do you think that makes it understandable that people are so easily jumping on the likes of the Tommy Robinson bandwagon?
I don't know, because for me, the whole Tommy Robinson, even Nigel Farage, is, in my opinion, based on racism. So is it triggering something that is subliminally prevalent in society? I'm asking the question, right? There is potential for that. We saw a degree of racism at the beginning of the Russian special military operation when people were effectively saying, yeah, we'll help Ukrainians because they look like us, right? And then effectively the racism against Russia. I mean, I was shocked by the level of vitriol from people in Britain against Russians, right? Russians themselves were being targeted, even though they lived in the UK for years or worked in the UK for years. We saw this, right? So I guess it is something that exists in all society, and at some point, yes, it can be triggered. I'm not going to say that Syria is holier than thou kind of thing. There are elements within Syria that have been triggered by the Jolani takeover into becoming racist and sectarian and being weaponized against the minorities. It happens. And I think it happens in every single society. So I think it's a combination. I think there may be an element of that. And then there is an element of people saying that they're defending British culture, history, society, which is understandable to a degree, because as we've talked about at UK Column, it is under attack, right? But just as in Syria, where Syrian society is inclusive, that is what Syrian society is. That is what Syrian culture is throughout history. It's accepted refugees from Palestine, from Iraq, and absorbed them into its society in a very embracing way. That's also what British society should be, isn't it? We should be embracing of the diverse communities, third, fourth generation immigrants into Britain who have been absorbed into British society and have contributed to British society.
Yeah, I don't have any issue with that. I take your point about the racist aspect of some of the major commentators and influencers. And there may be some of that amongst the general, but I think personally, the majority of people that are getting onto this are doing so partly from fear that their future is no longer existing as the country that they knew. But even there, I'm not convinced that most people even know what their country was or should be. I think there isn't a strong view of what even it is to be British. I think if you ask the average person what does it mean to be English, I'm not sure that they necessarily would come up with a terribly coherent answer. I think a part of the problem, you've touched on this in the course of this conversation. Part of the problem here has been that British culture has been weak for a long time. It has, as you said earlier, it has been absolutely decimated by the attack on the family, on the attack on our culture and our minds and so on.
Community.
Over a very long time.
We talk about religion, but effectively it's community.
The effect of migration on the British people would not have been anywhere near as overt if the culture hadn't been weak in the first place. I'll just mention this because it's something that drives me nuts. Whenever there's a big outcry about, for example, a Christian church being turned into a mosque, and this happens from time to time, and there's this huge outcry about it, and I'm thinking, well, hold on a second, why was the church empty? They didn't come and kick everybody out. The church was empty. The church is empty because people in Britain have abandoned their faith. Now, I'm personally not an active Christian. I'm not a Christian, but so I'm not. But I'm also not complaining if a church has been turned into a mosque. It's got to be, if you're gonna say that this can't happen, that it's an undermining of the traditional values of the country. You've got to have some traditional values, and
Exactly.
People have lost those a long time ago. So this was the cultural aspect of this is something that has already happened, and I'm not. I am sure that looking at Tommy Robinson is not going to be the way to fix that problem. That's for certain.
not.
Right.
No.
That right. So that's an issue. I think that I'm going to be very interested to see what happens over the coming days. But what I'm just going to say here is that I'm looking around at the flags that are up on flagpoles at the crosses, the red crosses have been drawn in every mini roundabout in the country and so on. And I'm looking at this and I'm saying, this looks very like Northern Ireland, right? Because Northern Ireland still, even though 1998 was when the sectarianism was supposed to have finished in that country, and still today there are flags up in every flagpole, and the country is as divided as it's ever been, right? So, and I'm starting to see England turning into the same type of thing. Now, this is just not good, and we can celebrate culture, we can celebrate the country in other ways. People will sometimes say, well, in other countries people fly their flags all the time. Yes, they do, and they've always done, but it has never been weaponized in the way that this is the key thing, I think, is the way things have been weaponized. Brexit was weaponized to divide. COVID was weaponized to divide. Migration has been weaponized to divide, and information has been weaponized to divide. And this I think is something that we have to get to grips with. Now the flag is being weaponized to divide.
And it's kind of interesting because, I mean, the first thing that comes into my mind is the Crusader mentality again, which of course Zionism is very much a part of. It's the new Crusader movement to effectively colonize this region, West Asia, but then I'm also seeing it appear in this guise. And, to come back to St. George, I mean, I don't know why people would feel offended by that. When I was in the Christian Orthodox towns that were under attack from the new Crusader movement led by Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and Israel, many of the icons were of St. George and the Dragon, right? So it is a regional symbol of resistance. And I don't think that should be offensive to anyone. Surely that should be something that should unite us, shouldn't it? And this is my problem, is like we're so fast to claim ownership and to partition and to become jingoistic in our ideology and our mentality, instead of understanding that this is a war against humanity and we're an integral part of humanity. Why are we trying to separate ourselves from that? Because the only way that this war against the transnational ruling elite and billionaire class and the oligarchy is ever going to be won is by, one, maintaining our humanity and compassion and sense of justice and integrity and dignity, and by understanding the only way we can win it is by uniting as humanity against the savagery and the violence that is being perpetrated by those that are ruling over us, whether it's in our own government or in the allies of our own government.
We're pretty much out of time now. Just what are your closing thoughts on this? What comes next?
Look, I just think as human beings, the only way that we're going to win this war is by, rather than burning bridges, creating them. And by actually reaching out to the communities that we're allowing ourselves to effectively criminalize and demonize. Today it's the Muslims. What's it going to be tomorrow? Is it going to be the Christians, maybe? Is it going to be, history teaches us we just get manipulated from one area of division to another. And the only way that you break that division is by actually remembering, this person is my neighbor, this person is a member of my family, this person is a member of my community, and rebuilding those communities, those links, those bridges. Instead of rejecting them, instead of partitioning them, instead of blockading them, basically, and creating further division, further partitions, further separation, further segregation, we should be working to reduce the divides and rebuild our society, which isn't necessarily going to be the society that we think it is. I mean, I would like to actually hear from people what they think British society should be, because I'm quite interested in that. For me, when I was growing up, it was the kindness, the compassion. If I fell over in the street, someone was going to pick me up, right? That's what the humor. Those were the things that represented Britain to me. And over time, that has been lost. We've become driven by fear to not go to the aid of someone in case that person is going to commit a crime against us. And society, you know, the government, media, and so on has been creating that separation from what made us the inclusive, generous society that we were. And I will say one thing. Despite all of the ravages of this region, you still find that hospitality, generosity, and kindness within society here on a scale that is unimaginable, considering what is going on. And so we're also capable of holding on and retaining those values that made Britain what it was.
Okay. Thank you, Vanessa. Let's leave that for today. That's been a hugely interesting conversation. We'll do this again soon.